Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a really fascinating journey ahead of us today. We're going to bridge the gap between these incredibly intimidating ancient texts and our modern world to figure out what these massive narratives actually mean. We'll be looking at ancient biblical history, specifically the historical accounts of miracles and the life of Jesus, and exploring how people today are interacting with these stories, why they sometimes really struggle with them, and how they're ultimately finding some pretty profound meaning. So let's just jump right in and ask a question that a lot of modern viewers actually face when they encounter historically accurate depictions of the ancient world. Is biblical history simply too scary? It's super easy to think of these stories as those sanitized, peaceful little tales we heard in childhood. But the reality of the first century world, it was harsh, like incredibly harsh. It was fraught with oppression, rampant illness, and just deep despair. And this raw reaction from a bewildered Reddit user who was watching the show The Chosen hits the nail on the head. They wrote that they watched about half of the first episode and it was just too much, too confusing, too scary, and too violent. And honestly, that perfectly captures how dark, demon-filled, and utterly confusing these ancient times can seem at first glance. This viewer was genuinely overwhelmed by the horror elements, the brutal reality of the Roman occupation, and the sheer desperation of the characters. Because when you present the ancient world exactly as it was, right before the arrival of hope, it can be a deeply unsettling place. Which brings us to the root of all that confusion. Section 1. A confusing ancient world, moving beyond the initial shock. Okay, so how do we actually get past that initial horror and shock? Well, we have to travel back in time to get the proper context of what was actually happening when these historical miracles took place. It's really interesting to contrast our modern expectations with the historical reality. In today's entertainment-driven culture, if we hear the word miracle, we're probably looking for a flashy magic trick, right? Or someone just showing off their power for personal gain. But according to the accounts, these inexplicable events were the exact opposite. They weren't magic tricks at all. They were deeply targeted acts of divine compassion meant to reveal authority and literally offer broken people a completely new start. Section 2. Miracles with a Purpose. Categorizing the inexplicable. To truly wrap our heads around these ancient texts, it helps to look at the historical accounts and sort these massive events into easily digestible categories. So the crucial point here is that these miracles were never just random. They actually fall into three very distinct buckets. You have power over illness, like healing leprosy, the blind, and the paralyzed. Then, power over nature, like turning water into wine or calming massive storms. And finally, power over death itself, literally raising the dead. Take the number 5,000, for example. This brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of that compassion. It represents the miraculous feeding of 5,000 men with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And get this, that number doesn't even include the women and children who were there. That's enough people to fill a small stadium. But there's a deeply tragic irony to this event in the text. The crowd was so focused on the spectacle of getting a free meal that they completely missed the deeper metaphorical message the text was trying to convey. Or consider the number 4. 4 agonizing days. That is how long a man named Lazarus lay dead in a tomb before, according to the narrative, he was called back to life. The text even points out that the body had already begun to smell. Yet, with a loud voice, Jesus called him out of the tomb, and he just walked out. This wasn't framed as some simple resuscitation. The text uses this specific event to demonstrate a definitive, absolute victory over the grave, designed to prepare the minds of the people for the ultimate message. Section 3. The ultimate message, mercy. The beating heart of the text. Because beneath all those grand displays of power over nature and sickness, there is a true emotional peak to these historical accounts, and that is profound, boundless mercy. We can actually map this out beautifully by looking at the famous story of the woman caught in adultery. It takes us on a journey from terrifying condemnation straight to total forgiveness. First, you have condemnation. This angry, self-righteous mob brings a woman caught in the act of adultery and demands the absolute harshest punishment of the law. Next comes silence. Jesus doesn't yell back at them. He simply bends down and begins writing on the ground. It's this profound, tension-filled pause that literally forces the accusers to look inward. Then the crowd leaves, one by one, from oldest to youngest, as their own hypocrisy is exposed. And finally, we reach forgiveness. It was this single, incredibly powerful statement that broke the tension. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. I mean, wow. It completely shattered the self-righteousness of the angry mob, and it perfectly personifies the text's concept of divine mercy, giving a totally broken person a second chance. He tells her to go and sin no more. It's a stunning reversal. He didn't excuse the behavior, but he completely removed the condemnation, offering a new path forward. And that right there is the absolute essence of the ancient text, a mercy that meets people in their absolute darkest moment. Section 4. Decoding the deep stories, finding clarity in the modern age. So bringing this all full circle back to that modern Reddit user who felt so completely overwhelmed earlier, how exactly are we meant to unpack these heavy, ancient, deep stories today, when the context is lost and the events just seem way too miraculous or violent to grasp? What's the game plan? Well, the Reddit community actually offered a fantastic, clear path forward, and it's a brilliant blueprint for anyone. Step 1, watch the material or read the text, even if it feels tough at first. Step 2, lean heavily on modern study tools and roundtables to give you that historical context. And step 3, find a community to help you discuss and translate that ancient context into your daily life. Because learning in isolation usually just leads to more confusion, but learning together, that brings absolute clarity. For instance, a ton of viewers highly recommended the totally free Roundtable feature on the Chosen app. It brings together this incredibly diverse panel to explain the biblical accuracy and the creative liberties behind every single episode. You have Dallas, the show's creator, sitting right alongside a Catholic priest, a Jewish rabbi, and an evangelical scholar. Together, they break down exactly why certain events were portrayed the way they were, what the cultural norms of the day actually were, and all the theological implications. It completely demystifies the whole experience. And furthermore, you've got massive online communities out there, like the YouTube channel Deep Bible Stories, that exists specifically to guide you line by line. It just proves that in the digital age, you're absolutely never alone in your historical confusion. They take viewers through the text book by book, chapter by chapter, line by line, providing the deep context you need to transform a confusing, ancient narrative into a living, breathing guide for life. So now that we've bridged the gap between the initial shock of ancient history and the boundless mercy at its core, the final question is for you. How will you step past the confusion and use these modern tools to explore the text for yourself? The tools to decode these complex narratives are literally right at your fingertips. Will you let ancient history remain a scary, confusing mystery,
Or will you start digging to uncover the profound human stories hidden right beneath the surface?
Hey everyone, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring a really fascinating dilemma. How do people in our fast-paced digital age process thousands of years-old stories of miracles, mercy, and divine signs? It's an incredible intersection of ancient, sometimes gritty texts and modern media.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll look at modern media and ancient texts, move into categorizing the great miracles, uncover the signs pointing to truth, discuss the power of mercy, and wrap up by seeking a deeper understanding. Let's get into it.
Starting off with Section 1, Modern Media and Ancient Texts, the viewer's dilemma. Now you might be wondering, why are ancient stories so confusing and frankly, kind of scary? We stumbled across this really interesting discussion on a Reddit forum where a user was watching a biblical adaptation for the very first time, and they brought up a great point. If the story of Jesus is fundamentally about love and redemption, why does the historical setting feel so intense and even frightening to a modern viewer?
You see, approaching ancient texts without any context can feel totally overwhelming. Just look at this raw, honest reaction from a viewer who was completely blindsided by the demonic possession and sheer darkness depicted in the show's first episode. They were genuinely looking for a cozy, family-friendly intro, but bam! They got hit with the brutal, gritty reality of first-century life.
But here's where it gets good. Another commenter chimed in with the exact vital context the original poster was missing. That ancient darkness, it isn't just there for shock value. No way. It perfectly sets the stage for the profound light and the miracles that follow. You literally have to see how broken the world was to fully grasp the sheer magnitude of the healing that arrives later.
Which brings us right to Section 2, categorizing the great miracles and organizing the ancient data. When you actually dig into the historical texts, you realize Jesus' actions weren't just random. They spanned very specific domains. We're talking physical healing, like curing the blind man, or commanding the elements, like literally calming a massive storm on the Sea of Galilee, and even overcoming death itself by raising Lazarus after he'd been in a tomb for 4 whole days. Every single category demonstrates a completely different facet of ultimate authority.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that these weren't just magic tricks for show. Every single physical healing carried a much deeper, underlying message about his true identity and compassion. Healing the paralytic wasn't just about making a guy walk. It was physical proof of an invisible authority to forgive sins. Turning water to wine at Cana? Sure, it saved a family from major social embarrassment, but it also symbolically previewed a heavenly feast.
All right, Section 3, Signs Pointing to Truth, the why behind the action. There's this fascinating, almost funny irony in the Gospel of John, specifically chapter 6. Jesus feeds over 5,000 people with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. Naturally, the next day, the crowd hunts him down for more. But Jesus essentially tells them they are totally missing the point. They just wanted a free meal. They love the physical relief, but they completely miss the massive spiritual sign right in front of them, that Jesus himself is the ultimate nourishment, the bread of life.
As one of our theological sources points out, every miracle points to a greater truth. Think about it. The physical relief of a full stomach was totally temporary. Those folks were definitely going to be hungry again the next day. But the authority and divinity revealed by that sign, that was eternal.
The miracles were specifically designed to pull the viewer's focus past the physical spectacle and toward a lasting spiritual reality.
Moving on to Section 4, the power of mercy, the ultimate miracle.
The story of the adulterous woman sets a really intense scene. Imagine a terrified person facing down an angry mob. Picture being completely surrounded by people armed with the harshness of the law, their eyes just full of contempt and self-righteousness, totally ready to execute a death sentence. It literally represents the absolute darkest moment of human condemnation.
But Jesus didn't meet their shouting with more shouting. Instead, he did something totally unexpected. He offered this incredibly powerful sacred pause. He just bent down and started writing in the dust. And this deliberate silence acted like a giant mirror, forcing all those angry accusers to stop their frenzy and actually look inward at their own flaws.
Then, with just one single sentence, the entire dynamic flips. The mob's hypocrisy is completely shattered. From the oldest to the youngest, these accusers are forced to confront their own imperfection. So what do? They drop their stones and walk away, leaving only the woman and the one single person who actually had the authority to condemn her.
But here's the kicker. He doesn't condemn her. The ultimate miracle here is a completely transformed life through divine compassion. Those gentle words, "I do not condemn you," acted like a cooling stream to a parched soul. He gave her the gift of a second chance, a real opportunity to live a life worthy of that boundless love. It is just a prime example of mercy acting as a profound, world-altering miracle.
And that brings us to our final stop, Section 5, seeking a deeper understanding and building the foundation.
Today, platforms like the Deep Bible Stories channel are actually helping people reconstruct that deep Acts 2 style fellowship. It's often noted how the modern church has kind of lost that tight-knit community you see in the early days of the texts. But believers are now using the digital world as a brand new mission field. They're moving way beyond surface-level reading to build true, highly supportive spiritual communities online.
By studying the scripture line by line together, they uncover these incredibly consistent attributes of God across the texts. We're talking from the Creator in Genesis to the Deliverer in Exodus, all the way to the Covenant Lord in Deuteronomy. It reveals this really beautiful metaphor. In all these ancient texts, God is the fire, while humanity, even heavy hitters like Moses, are merely the vessels carrying that light.
I just absolutely love this quote from the source material because it perfectly summarizes the entire goal of understanding these ancient signs. Aging happens to the body, but finishing well happens in the soul. All those miracles, all that mercy, all this community building, it all points inward. True transformation doesn't happen just by witnessing some big spectacle. It happens on the inside, in the soul. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder today. Are you just surviving a long time, or are you actually finishing well in the soul? Don't just settle for reading the stories or watching the adaptations on a surface level. Let the deep meaning of these ancient signs guide how you finish your own journey. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and keep seeking those deeper truths.
Welcome back to the Explainer, everyone. Today we are diving into a truly fascinating topic, exactly how God leads humanity. Now, the whole concept of divine guidance can sometimes feel, a bit vast or distant. But when we actually dig into the Christian texts, we find a leadership framework that is incredibly detailed, super practical, and honestly, highly applicable. We're not here to debate dogma today. Instead, we're going to unpack the specific methods and philosophies of this guidance right from the source material. To really get this, we have to start with a massive paradox. Think about it. If Jesus was divine, he could have easily set himself up with a comfortable, powerful life, like earthly royalty, right? So why intentionally choose a path filled with poverty, hardship, and ultimately extreme suffering? It seems totally counterintuitive. But cracking this paradox, that is absolutely crucial. It's the first key to understanding this entire framework of divine guidance. So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to break down this approach through 5 specific modalities. First, the shepherd model. Second, leadership by sacrifice. Third, guidance through parables. Fourth, the gaze of mercy. And finally, empowerment and companionship. Let's jump in. Starting with section 1, the shepherd model. This is the core anchor metaphor. Throughout these texts, the image of a shepherd pops up constantly as the ultimate anchor for this leadership style. And it's a stark contrast to a top-down authoritarian boss. Take this quote from the Gospel of John. "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." We're not talking about some cold direction barked from a distance or ruling by force. It's a style built entirely on relationship, love, and intimate knowledge. The leader actually knows each follower. And they follow, not because they're terrified, but because they recognize that genuine voice of authenticity and kindness. Moving right along to section 2, leadership by sacrifice. Why choose suffering? And this brings us right back to that paradox we talked about earlier. According to the texts, choosing a difficult life wasn't some random accident. It was entirely intentional. He walked through that suffering to be a practical model for humanity. The takeaway here is that by experiencing pain firsthand, he showed that life's hardships are actually an essential part of spiritual maturity. Plus, it models pure, unconditional love. I mean, a leader who is literally willing to sacrifice his own life for his followers, that is the ultimate proof of profound generosity. All right, on to section 3, guidance through parables, basically teaching through stories. An exceptional leader doesn't just act, they have to communicate their vision effectively. And what's super fascinating here is how the texts distinguish parables from regular fables. Fables, like Aesop's, usually give you a simple moral wrapped in a cute animal story. But parables, they go way deeper. The sources emphasize that a parable isn't just about handing you a framed moral lesson. It drops the listener into a realistic, everyday situation and forces them to actively reflect. You can't just passively listen and nod along. You have to ask yourself, wait, where do I actually stand in this story? And to reach everyone from wealthy officials to uneducated farmers, he used vivid, everyday stuff. We're talking farmers sowing seeds, tax collectors, or the really profound story of the prodigal son. By using these daily images, he made highly abstract concepts about the kingdom of God totally relatable. The ideas just kind of slipped right into the minds of the listeners in the most flexible, brilliant way possible. Let's look at section 4 now, the gaze of mercy. This is all about compassion in action. Because, those teachings weren't just theoretical ideas, they were lived out. In these narratives, especially in the parable of the Good Samaritan, we see a very specific depiction of how God operates. The texts describe a God who doesn't just ignore us or look down on our sorrow from the clouds. Instead, he literally stoops down to our level. He becomes a servant to bind up wounds and heal. It's this incredibly active, participatory companionship. He meets humanity in their absolute worst, weakest moments and stays right there with them. And there's a really subtle strategic detail here, too. When dealing with people society had totally rejected, Jesus didn't flex his authority to intimidate them. He wrapped his divine nature in human gentleness. Like when he healed the paralyzed man and it's calmly said, "Thy sins are forgiven," it completely baffled the crowd. They were thinking, only God has the power to forgive sins. The texts showed that by offering this limitless, unexpected mercy, it acted as a wildly powerful, indirect way of revealing who he was. He let the listeners draw that massive conclusion all on their own.
Finally, we hit section 5, empowerment and companionship. How do you pass on the legacy? Because any sustainable leadership system has got to have a solid succession plan. According to the sources, the first people drafted for this weren't brilliant political elites or scholars. Jesus literally walked down a beach and called ordinary fishermen, guys like Peter, James, and John, telling them to drop their nets and become fishers of men. He built this team by hand. He walked the fields with them, watched them practice teaching, and listened to their updates. It was incredibly direct, hands-on mentorship. But the absolute pinnacle of this prep work happened at the Last Supper. This is where he handed over the core mission. And what's amazing is he didn't hand them a giant binder of rigid rules. He gave them one single command: to love one another just as he had loved them. The ultimate identifying mark of his followers wasn't going to be power or force. It was going to be internal unity and mutual love. The genius of this ongoing guidance is perfectly captured in the famous metaphor of the vine and the branches. Jesus calls himself the vine, the ultimate source of life and truth. His followers are the branches. And obviously, a branch can only bear fruit if it stays firmly attached to the main stem. It's a beautiful way of illustrating that this guidance is an intimately connected, continuous process. You just can't do it in isolation. So how did this massive transition actually play out? This timeline gives us the rapid-fire progression of the succession plan. It kicks off with those final teachings at the Last Supper, goes through the resurrection, and hits the ascension when he departed the physical world. But the guidance didn't just stop. It was immediately followed by Pentecost, the arrival of the Holy Spirit, which provided the exact wisdom and power the apostles needed to officially step up and lead the early church. And in the narrative, this transition is completely seamless. The moment the physical mission wraps up with the ascension, boom, we see the direct result: the apostles, led by Peter, immediately taking on earthly leadership. They were fully equipped to carry the legacy forward and spread the message worldwide. The texts tell us that this very same guidance continues today through something called the key of obedience. Now, obedience here isn't about blind, mindless submission. It's about having complete trust in a greater love. Think about it. When we're impatient with each other, it usually means we lack trust. But when we obey out of love, even when it's really hard, that's when we unlock the door to truth and actually receive that ongoing guidance from the Holy Spirit in our everyday lives. So when we look at how God leads humanity through all these modalities, from a shepherd who sacrifices everything, to a teacher who uses daily stories to wake us up, to a divine being stooping down to bandage our wounds, this whole framework always comes back to freedom and mercy. The source texts never try to force our compliance. Instead, they leave us with a really profound introspective challenge. After seeing all these methods of guidance driven by pure love, look inward. Do we actually have the courage to put our faith in this divine compassion? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I can't wait to see you next time as we keep unpacking more amazing concepts like this.
Chào mừng các bạn đến với bài phân tích hôm nay. Chà, hôm nay chúng ta sẽ cùng nhau bóc tách một chủ đề thực sự rất hấp dẫn đấy, cách Chúa dẫn dắt con người. Bạn biết không, đã bao giờ bạn tự hỏi, một đấng tối cao thì sẽ hướng dẫn nhân loại theo cách thức như thế nào chưa? Cụ thể hơn nhé, liệu Ngài dẫn dắt chúng ta bằng những luật lệ khắt khe, đòn roi trừng phạt, hay là bằng một phương pháp nào đó hoàn toàn khác biệt? Câu hỏi này thực sự thách thức trực tiếp những định kiến mà nhiều người trong chúng ta thường có. Lịch sử cho thấy chúng ta hay tưởng tượng ra một vị quan tòa mặt lạnh lùng, lăm lăm cuốn sổ ghi chép mọi lỗi lầm để tính sổ. Nhưng thực tế phương pháp dẫn dắt của Ngài có phải như vậy không? Hay là một điều gì đó hoàn toàn khác? Để có câu trả lời, hôm nay chúng ta sẽ lướt qua 5 khía cạnh cốt lõi, lần lượt là: 1. Thiên chúa của tình thương. 2. Dạy dỗ bằng dụ ngôn. 3. Bài giảng trên núi. 4. Những tay đánh lưới người. Và cuối cùng là sự dẫn dắt của Thánh Linh. Cấu trúc này sẽ cho chúng ta một lộ trình cực kỳ rõ ràng. Nào, chúng ta cùng đi ngay vào phần đầu tiên, Thiên Chúa của tình thương. Bạn sẽ thấy có một sự tương phản cực kỳ lớn ở đây. Quan điểm cũ thường coi tôn giáo như một cuộc giao dịch sòng phẳng vậy. Bạn làm việc tốt, tích lũy công đức để mua lấy sự tha thứ, đúng không? Nhưng mặc khải mới do Chúa Giêsu mang đến lại hoàn toàn đảo lộn tư duy đó. Thiên Chúa không phải là một viên kế toán ngồi cộng trừ sổ sách. Ngài là một người cha nhân hậu, chủ động đi tìm kiếm và chữa lành cho những kẻ lạc lối. Sự dẫn dắt đó bắt nguồn từ tình yêu thương vô điều kiện. Nghe thử câu trích dẫn này nhé. Người không cứ tội ta mà xét xử, không trả báo ta xứng với lỗi lầm. Khách quan mà nói, chiều sâu của sự tha thứ này gần như là vô lý đối với tiêu chuẩn thông thường của con người chúng ta, phải không? Nó cho thấy một sự kiên nhẫn vô bờ bến, một sự nhân tử từ chối việc bỏ rơi nhân loại dù chúng ta có mắc lỗi đến đâu đi chăng nữa. Và điều tuyệt vời nhất là sự dẫn dắt thần thánh này không hề xa vời tít trên mây xanh đâu. Nó chính là sức mạnh thực tế giúp bạn đứng dậy sau mỗi lần vấp ngã. Đôi khi, bạn cảm nhận được sự hướng dẫn của Chúa ngay trong những điều rất đỗi bình dị. Tình yêu thương vô bờ của một người mẹ, một cái vỗ vai từ người bạn, hay thậm chí là sự giúp đỡ của một người hoàn toàn xa lạ trên phố. Tiếp theo, chúng ta cùng chuyển sang phần thứ 2, dạy dỗ bằng dụ ngôn. Chỗ này rất nhiều người hay nhầm lẫn nhá. Chúng ta hay đánh đồng ngụ ngôn với dụ ngôn. Nhưng khoan đã, chúng khác nhau hoàn toàn. Ngụ ngôn là những câu chuyện mượn con vật biết nói để dạy luân lý đơn giản, kiểu như chuyện ngụ ngôn Asep ấy. Còn dụ ngôn của Chúa Giêsu thì sao? Ngài lấy ngay những hình ảnh từ cuộc sống đời thường, cực kỳ chân thực, để mở ra những mầu nhiệm vĩ đại và đặt người nghe vào tình thế phải tự đưa ra quyết định. Sức mạnh thực sự của dụ ngôn nằm ở chỗ, nó mượn những hình ảnh rất quen thuộc như người nông dân gieo giống hay người thu thuế để hé lộ bí mật về nước trời. Và điểm mấu chốt là nó đòi hỏi bạn phải có lập trường. Bạn không thể nghe xong một dụ ngôn, gật gù rồi quay lưng bỏ đi được. Bạn bắt buộc phải soi chiếu lại bản thân, tự hỏi mình đang ở đâu trong câu chuyện đó và từ đó thay đổi góc nhìn của chính mình. Hình ảnh mang tính biểu tượng này, người chăn hiền lành, minh họa hoàn hảo cho khái niệm đó. Không có đàn roi răn đe. Sự dẫn dắt diễn ra qua một sự gắn kết cực kỳ gần gũi. Người chăn biết rõ bầy chiên, yêu thương chúng và bầy chiên tự nguyện đi theo vì chúng nhận ra giọng nói của người. Một cách hướng dẫn nhẹ nhàng nhưng lại bền chặt tuyệt đối. Rồi, bây giờ chúng ta đến với phần thứ 3, bài giảng trên núi. Hãy thử nhắm mắt lại và hình dung khung cảnh bên sườn núi này. Đám đông tụ họp lại, hoàn toàn bị thu hút. Chúa Giêsu đang giảng dạy với một uy quyền đáng kinh ngạc, nhưng đó không phải là uy quyền để đe dọa hay ép buộc. Ngài dùng sự thống cảm sâu sắc để hướng dẫn họ. Bài giảng này thực sự mang tính cách mạng đấy. Tại sao ư? Vì Ngài đưa ra những nguyên tắc sống vô cùng thực tế, chứ không chỉ thuyết trình những khái niệm trừu tượng. Đặc biệt nhất là, thay vì mở đầu bằng việc răn đe hay của trách, đều rất phổ biến ở các tôn giáo thời cổ đại, thì Ngài lại bắt đầu bằng 9 mối phúc thật. Ngài trực tiếp giải phóng con người, khỏi nỗi sợ hãi về những thần linh luôn trực chờ nổi giận, chỉ cho họ con đường hướng tới hạnh phúc đích thực.
Chuyển sang phần thứ tư, những tay đánh lứa người.
Bạn biết không, sự dẫn dắt này cần phải được tiếp nối và mở rộng. Mọi thứ bắt đầu từ một khoảnh khắc lịch sử nhưng cực kỳ bình dị. Chúa Giêsu đi gọi những ngư dân đang làm việc, bảo họ để lại tất cả và trở thành những tay đánh lưới người. Ngài không chọn giới tinh hoa học thức uyên bác, mà gọi những con người lao động rất đỗi bình thường làm thế hệ lãnh đạo nòng cốt.
Đó chính là nền tảng để xây dựng giáo hội. Bằng việc phong chức cho 12 sứ đồ, Chúa Giêsu đã trao thẩm quyền để họ tiếp tục công việc. Ngài sai họ đi khắp nơi để giảng dạy và chữa lành, chính thức thiết lập một cấu trúc lãnh đạo bằng con người để duy trì sự hướng dẫn thần thánh.
Nhưng tất nhiên, có một quy tắc sống còn được đặt ra ở đây, thông qua ẩn dụ cây nho và cành nho. Nó cực kỳ trực quan. Chúa là cây nho, còn những người đi theo là cành. Sự dẫn dắt của con người sẽ hoàn toàn vô dụng nếu họ cắt đứt kết nối với cội nguồn. Các cành nho chỉ có thể sinh ra trái tốt lành khi duy trì sự gắn kết sâu sắc và liên tục với nguồn gốc thần thánh của mình.
Nào, chúng ta cùng đi đến phần cuối cùng của ngày hôm nay. 5. Sự dẫn dắt của Thánh Linh.
Trước khi rời đi, Chúa Giêsu đã để lại một lời hứa vô cùng quan trọng. Ngài sẽ không để nhân loại phải mồ côi bơ vơ. Đức Thánh Linh sẽ đến và ngự ngay trong lòng mỗi người tin. Bạn hãy hình dung nó giống như một chiếc la bàn nội tâm vậy, một nguồn cung cấp sức mạnh và sự dẫn dắt liên tục cho chúng ta trong cuộc sống mỗi ngày. Khoảnh khắc Chúa Giêsu thăng thiên thực sự là một hình ảnh ngoạn mục, giống như lúc trao lại chiếc gậy tiếp sức trong cuộc thi chạy vậy. Ngài chính thức giao phó lại sứ mệnh trần gian cho những người đi theo mình. Cùng với sự đồng hành thầm lặng của Thánh Linh, con người giờ đây đã được trang bị đầy đủ để tự bước đi và dẫn dắt lẫn nhau bằng chính lòng thương xót mà họ đã nhận được.
Vậy, sau tất cả những gì chúng ta đã cùng nhau khám phá, câu hỏi cuối cùng dành cho bạn là: bạn đã sẵn sàng tĩnh lặng lại, nhìn sâu vào tâm hồn mình và để cho sự dẫn dắt đầy nhân hậu, kiên nhẫn này định hướng từng bước đi của bạn trong cuộc sống hàng ngày chưa? Hãy mang theo suy ngẫm đó nhé. Cảm ơn các bạn đã đồng hành cùng tôi trong bài phân tích hôm nay. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn.
Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a highly structured look at an ancient figure who is, honestly, completely dominating modern screens right now. We're going to examine exactly how people today are intensely consuming media about Jesus of Nazareth. And more importantly, we're going to unpack the deep historical meaning behind his most famous acts, his miracles.
Here is our roadmap to make sense of all this information. First, we'll explore modern digital curiosity. Then we'll categorize his extraordinary acts, uncover their true purpose, and finally, wrap up with a profound story of a second chance.
So let's start with our first section, Seeking Jesus in Media. It's absolutely fascinating to look at how people today are intensely seeking out these 2,000-year-old stories online. I mean, just look at this massive number right here. 669,000. That is the subscriber count for a YouTube channel called Deep Bible Stories. It absolutely proves that there is an immense modern hunger to understand Scripture. People aren't just skimming anymore, you know? They want to go deeper, chapter by chapter, line by line. But as we'll see, stepping into this ancient world, well, it isn't always easy. Take this quote from a Reddit user who was navigating the highly popular TV series The Chosen. They wrote that watching just half of the first episode was, quote, too much, saying it was too confusing and too scary and too violent. And I think this perfectly captures how diving into biblical media can sometimes feel incredibly intimidating for a newcomer. The ancient world was a really harsh place.
But fans of the show point out a really vital contrast to help newcomers make sense of all this. They note that the necessary historical darkness, we're talking demonic possession, brutal Roman oppression, and just violent historical realities, is there to show exactly why the light of Christ's arrival was needed in the first place. It contrasts heavily with the later, family-friendly moments where Jesus is healing, bringing peace, and laughing with children. It makes the whole grand narrative suddenly make sense. To clear up that confusion and avoid cognitive overload, let's move right into our second section, 3 categories of miracles. Because how do we structure all these supernatural events so they're actually easy to grasp?
Well, the crucial point here is that we can sort these dozens of complex historical events into 3 easily digestible buckets: healing, controlling nature, and resurrection. By breaking it down like this, that overwhelming list of miracles suddenly becomes a structured, purposeful portfolio of actions. And if we look at the theological breakdown from our sources, something kind of surprising is revealed. While the big, flashy miracles get a lot of attention in pop culture, the vast majority of Christ's documented miracles, 65%, were actually focused purely on healing the sick and broken. 25% were about controlling nature, and just 10% were resurrections. Above all else, he was primarily a healer. Let's dive into that biggest category for a second: healing. Because these weren't just quick medical fixes. He cleansed lepers who were literally banished from society. He restored sight to men who were blind from birth. And he healed the paralyzed, granting them the physical power to walk again. These healing miracles broke severe social stigmas of the time. It showed Jesus willingly touching the untouchable, providing profound physical and social restoration. Essentially, he gave them their lives back.
Then we have the miracles, where he controlled nature. Here, he bent the very laws of physics to provide and protect. He turned water into fine wine, just to save a family's honor at a wedding in Cana. He calmed the violent storm on the Sea of Galilee with a single word to protect his terrified disciples. And, famously, he multiplied 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed a massive, hungry crowd of over 5,000 people.
And finally, in the absolute ultimate display of authority, we have the resurrection miracles. He raised the 12-year-old daughter of Jairus, resurrected the only son of a grieving widow in Nain, and called his friend Lazarus right out of the tomb after he had been dead for 4 whole days. These acts served to prove his power over death itself, leaving even his closest followers in complete awe.
But it begs the question, why exactly did he perform these reality-bending acts? Were they just magic tricks to gather a crowd? Let's transition to our third section, the purpose of the signs.
The sources make a critical distinction here, and it's a huge takeaway. The Gospel of John refers to these miracles as signs. A sign is an extraordinary, miraculous event pointing to a larger spiritual truth. They confirmed his divine authority and his boundless empathy for human suffering. They were literally never meant to just serve as a magic trick or some empty spectacle.
In fact, Jesus actually rebuked a crowd for missing this exact point. As this quote from John chapter 6 shows, he tells the crowd, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves." I mean, they just wanted a free meal. They saw the miracle, sure, but they completely missed the true spiritual sign of who he was.
So, the core takeaway from the historical texts is that he never performed miracles for applause or personal gain, not once. The sources frame every single miracle as a deliberate, targeted invitation to repentance. It was an invitation for the observer to change their heart to find true salvation, and to recognize divine love in action.
Now let's move to our final section, experiencing infinite divine mercy. We're going to see how all this awe-inspiring power over life, death, and nature funnels down into one deeply personal, quiet moment of mercy.
Let's walk through the dramatic pacing of this incredible story from the Gospel of John. First, an angry mob brings forward a woman caught in adultery, violently demanding her execution. But Jesus doesn't yell back. He silently bends down and writes in the dust. Then he issues this brilliant challenge. Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone. The intense tension in that moment completely dissolves as the crowd slowly disperses, leaving them entirely alone. And finally, he offers her total forgiveness.
Which brings us to the climax of her story. He looks at this terrified woman, completely alone with him, and says, I do not condemn you either. Go, and from now on, do not sin anymore. In an instant, he replaced a horrific, guaranteed death sentence with a gentle, life-altering offer of absolute forgiveness.
Because this act of mercy was not just about saving her physical life. As our sources beautifully point out, it was a spiritual resurrection for a soul that felt completely, utterly condemned. He didn't just save her from the stones, he utilized his divine authority to give her a completely clean slate and the strength to rebuild her life from the ground up.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought. If the sources suggest the ultimate miracle isn't walking on water or multiplying food, but rather the quiet, profound gift of a second chance, how does that change the way we view power and mercy today? When you look past the sheer spectacle of the miracles, how does this ancient message challenge our modern perspectives? Thank you so much for joining me on this structured journey through the text. Keep learning, keep seeking, and I'll catch you in the next one.
We live in a world that constantly pushes us to accumulate as much as possible: money, status, attention. But the core spirit of religious life goes in the exact opposite direction. So why would anyone willingly give up everything the world desires to choose a difficult, completely countercultural path? In this explainer, we're going to break down these radical choices.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Just think about this incredibly radical quote from the gospel. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will save it. It sounds like a paradox, right? But this is actually the fundamental lens we need to analyze the concept of self-sacrifice, the core principle that breathes life into the monastic and religious path.
That quote really forces us to stop and wonder, what actually drives a person to surrender their wealth, their status, and all their personal comfort to live this out? What kind of psychological and spiritual motivations are so powerful that someone would leave absolutely everything behind just to serve others unconditionally? To find the answer, we'll be breaking down the 4 defining pillars of this lifestyle found in our source material. First, the foundation of service. Second, obedience and renunciation. Third, the mission of mercy. And finally, the cross in community. Let's move right into the first pillar, the foundation of service. Where does this idea of servant leadership actually come from? It all starts with a complete redefinition of power. Picture the Last Supper, where Jesus washed his disciples' feet. That single action radically inverted the normal understanding of power and status. Suddenly, power doesn't mean standing at the top and demanding to be served. It means actively serving others and placing the needs of the community way above any self-aggrandizement. And what's brilliant is how this connects directly to us today. True leadership, whether in a family or a massive business, is grounded in humility. Serving doesn't mean degrading yourself or losing your value. Not at all. It's actually the ability to recognize the needs of others, which is exactly how you build long-lasting trust.
Moving on to the second section, obedience and renunciation. This is about the difficult surrender of personal will and material wealth.
Now look at this sharp contrast. On one hand, you have the secular pursuits most people chase: a noble inheritance, fancy clothes, personal ambition. On the other hand, you have the true story of St. Aloysius Gonzaga. This young nobleman did something shocking for his time. He voluntarily gave up his massive inheritance, traded his luxurious clothes for a humble habit, and chose to obey incredibly strict, simple daily rules.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how St. Catherine defined obedience. To her, obedience wasn't just blindly, grudgingly following rules. She explained it as a profound mystery of love, humility, and absolute trust in Christ. It's not about suppression, it's about freeing your heart to love fully.
And this brings us to a classic anecdote about St. Thomas Aquinas. When he was young, because of his large size and quiet nature, he was mockingly called the dumb ox. But instead of getting angry, he patiently endured the bullying and dove deeper into prayer. Ultimately, it was the roar from the brilliant mind of that dumb ox that literally filled the world, making him one of history's greatest thinkers.
Pillar number 3, the mission of mercy. This is where we shift focus from inward vows to radical outward action for the world. Our sources highlight a fascinating philosophical distinction here. Christian mercy is rooted in the belief of a personal creator, where humanity is made in God's image. On the flip side, Buddhist compassion is rooted in a deep sense of cosmic solidarity and responsibility. While the foundational motivations definitely differ, both of these worldviews promote profound peace and an intense care for the vulnerable.
To see how this mercy translates into reality, let's walk through the vivid transformation of St. Camillus. He started as a discharged soldier with a gambling problem, ending up as a penniless builder. But then, a turning point. While praying in front of a crucifix, he miraculously heard Christ reach out and call him. From that moment on, he dedicated the rest of his life entirely to serving the sick. And this brilliantly illustrates how St. Vincent de Paul turned theological mercy into direct, gritty action. He didn't just preach from a distance. He bought a house specifically to serve sick and marginalized galley slaves, people who were literally chained in ships and treated like outcasts by society. But this grand spirit isn't just stuck in the past. It's alive today. Just look at the Rosary Sisters of Buichu as a modern application. They live by a simple but powerful motto: using perfect charity to bring salvation to all. They're continuing that legacy, applying this radical mercy to everyday life.
Which brings us to our fourth and final pillar, the cross and community. This is where we ground these lofty spiritual ideals into the gritty reality of living together. Based on the Stations of the Cross excerpts we're analyzing, the true cross of religious life often isn't some grand martyrdom. It's highly practical. It's about embracing daily responsibilities instead of avoiding them. It means biting your tongue to stop slandering, attacking, or gossiping. Practical mercy is actively protecting the reputation of your community members and removing those daily barriers of division and prejudice. So the crucial point is this: becoming a true light to the world starts from the inside out.
It's exactly the ability to dismantle hatred, friction, and division from within their own community that allows these believers to become a true beacon of light to the outside world.
To wrap up our explainer today, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. In a modern world that is completely obsessed with self-promotion and personal gain, is this spirit of selfless monastic service actually the ultimate rebellion? Thanks for joining me today. Take some time to reflect on how you might be able to apply this radical spirit of service in your own family or workplace. Catch you next time. Welcome back to The Explainer. So, have you ever really stopped to wonder what actually drives someone to just surrender all their worldly pursuits? I mean, completely giving up wealth, status, and even personal autonomy for a life of total spiritual dedication? It's an incredibly radical choice, and honestly, it kind of baffles the modern world. Today, we're diving deep into the spirit of religious and consecrated life. We're going to break down the theological and practical pillars that uphold this deeply unique calling. All right, let's get right into it. Here's a quick look at our roadmap. We'll be walking through 5 foundational pillars of Catholic consecrated life today: the origins of service, the spirit of poverty, the key of obedience, the cross and community, and finally, living perfect charity. Starting off with part 1, the origins of service. You know, to really understand this calling, we have to travel all the way back to the original blueprint, the one set by Jesus Christ during the Last Supper. See, the worldly view of power is basically like a ladder, right? You climb it specifically so others can serve you. But Jesus completely flipped that on its head. He subverted all human expectations. By actually getting down and washing his disciples' feet, he showed us that true authority is rooted entirely in humility. Service isn't about lowering your dignity at all. Actually, it's about recognizing the needs of others and putting the community first. So when someone dedicates their life to God in a consecrated order, they are absolutely anchoring themselves to that exact spirit of humble, selfless service. A lot of people think they're just trying to escape the real world, but no, that's not it at all. They're seeking to serve it in the most fundamental way possible. They are literally adopting that posture of washing the feet of the marginalized, the sick, and the poor. Moving on to our second pillar, the spirit of poverty. Now, true service requires radical sacrifice, and that begins with the Evangelical Counsel of Poverty. And let me tell you, this is way more than just emptying a bank account. Just look at St. Aloysius Gonzaga. This guy was born into massive aristocratic wealth. But what did he do? He gladly surrendered his entire rich inheritance, literally took off his luxurious garments, and put on the rough, itchy habit of a Jesuit novice. And the crazy thing is, he viewed this as a joyful liberation. It allowed him to truly embody Christ-like poverty and rely entirely on God's providence instead of relying on earthly security. Because the crucial point here is that poverty, in this specific context, is really all about absolute trust. Take a look at this incredible quote from Saint Teresa of Avila. She was trying to build a new monastery, and she found herself with practically zero funds. But she just boldly declared, "Teresa and these few coins are nothing, but God, Teresa and these coins are enough." I mean, wow, what a stunning way to reframe wealth, right? It shows how absolute trust in God transforms a few mere coins into real spiritual abundance. So it's not about just having nothing. It's about realizing that having God means you literally have everything you need. Next up, pillar number 3, the key of obedience. So we live in an era that absolutely prizes personal autonomy, right?
So taking a strict vow to obey a human superior, well, it sounds incredibly restrictive to most of us. But if we look at it through a theological lens, like how St. Catherine explained it, obedience is not some sort of blind restriction. It's actually a key. She taught that God the Father sent the Word incarnate to give us this exact key of obedience, and practicing it literally opens the door to genuine truth and profound trust. It's all about willingly aligning your own desires with God's will, even when it's really, really difficult.
To paint a vivid picture of this, let's look at Saint Jane Frances de Chantal. She founded the Order of the Visitation with this very specific, deeply cherished goal. She wanted her sisters to leave the convent and serve the sick and poor right in the slums. But then her local bishop stepped in and abruptly forbade it, ordering them to become a cloistered teaching order instead. Now, rather than fighting or rebelling to protect her own personal vision, she completely pivoted. She humbly and patiently changed her congregation's entire mission simply out of obedience. That right there is the radical, ego-crushing nature of true religious obedience.
All right, bringing us to part 4, the cross and community.
Now, it's one thing to make these lofty vows all by yourself as an individual. It is quite another to actually live them out 24/7 alongside other flawed human beings. Community life is gritty and it's extremely challenging. As we see reflected in meditations on the Stations of the Cross, members can easily fall into the trap of, avoiding duties and shifting their burdens onto others. And it gets worse. The sources even point out the real danger of crucifying fellow members with prejudice and suspicion, or completely putting an end to someone's reputation through defamation. These very real human failings end up building some pretty dark walls of division.
But the solution to these everyday challenges is exactly what true religious life demands, and that's carrying the cross together. Instead of tearing each other down or defaming one another, a consecrated community is explicitly called to replace those dark divisions with the radiant light of the gospel. That means constantly tearing down those walls of suspicion. It means actively building mutual trust and basically lighting fires of hope for one another. In this life, the cross isn't just some individual burden you carry alone. It's the very anchor of their shared communal life.
Which brings us to our 5th and final pillar, living perfect charity.
At the end of the day, all the poverty, the strict obedience, the messy community struggles, they all exist for one absolute supreme goal, living perfect charity. And there's this really beautiful encapsulation of this. It's the guiding motto of the Sisters of the Holy Rosary of Bu Chu over in Vietnam. Their rule states, with the spirit of perfect charity, the Rosary Sisters, together with Mary, live the mystery of salvation and bring the grace of salvation to everyone. It's incredibly powerful. By completely emptying themselves, they actually become these overflowing vessels of God's immense mercy, fully tasked with bringing that saving grace to absolutely every single person they encounter.
So as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to turn this directly over to you. Because the thing is, you don't have to wear a habit or move into a monastery to actually embrace these foundational truths. How can you apply the spirit of perfect charity, humble service, and boundless mercy right now in your own daily life? Where can you wash the feet of those around you today? Because these pillars of consecrated holiness, they aren't just for the saints in the history books. They are a radical, open invitation for all of us to completely transform our own personal journeys. Thanks so much for exploring this with me today, and as always, keep learning.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack something absolutely profound: the concept of mercy. We'll be looking at how ancient biblical teachings actually merge perfectly with our modern lives, focusing specifically on how we can truly feel and experience it, that core idea of how to experience mercy in our daily routines. So, let me ask you something right off the bat. Have you ever been deeply hurt or maybe even betrayed by a close friend and then actually tried to forgive them? It is incredibly tough, right? This highlights a very real human challenge. Swallowing our own pride and looking past our personal pain to forgive someone who wronged us requires a massive amount of tolerance. And let's be honest, that doesn't always come naturally to us. All right, let's look at section 1, the example of forgiveness. Our sources point to literally one of the most powerful statements ever recorded to show what the ultimate sacrifice of mercy looks like. The texts emphasize that Jesus, even while suffering unimaginable physical agony on the cross, actually prayed for the very people who were executing him. He wasn't just enduring the pain, he was demonstrating an incredibly expansive heart. It sends this timeless message that even on our absolute darkest, most painful moments, forgiveness is actually possible if we can find a truly selfless perspective. And there's another incredible example from the texts. Picture a woman caught in adultery, dragged before this furious crowd. They're armed with strict laws and literally ready to execute her with stones. But Jesus, he doesn't join the mob. His response proves a key point about divine mercy. It isn't about harsh condemnation or keeping this rigid scorecard of everything you've done wrong. Instead, it's about offering a completely clean slate. It's about giving someone their dignity back so they can rebuild their life. Moving right along to section 2, lessons from the parables. You've probably heard the famous parable of the Good Samaritan. A man is beaten, robbed, and left half dead on the road. The text sets up this stark contrast. The religious elites, the priest and the Levite, they literally saw the victim, but kept their hearts completely closed and walked by on the other side of the road. But then the Samaritan, a total social outcast at the time, feels this profound empathy and takes immediate, costly action to bandage the man and pay for his care. It perfectly shows how true mercy completely shatters social boundaries. To really grasp why the Samaritan acted, the sources highlight a beautiful concept, translated in Vietnamese as chait long tung. This is not just some vague feeling of pity. It's described as this deep internal urging, literally a physical vibration in your gut when you see someone else suffering. It means to genuinely share their pain. It's an empathy so overwhelmingly powerful that it physically moves you to get your hands dirty and help. Building on that kind of active love, the parables of the lost sheep and the prodigal son give us a slightly different angle. We see a shepherd leaving 99 sheep behind just to fiercely track down the one that wandered off. We see a father running down the road with open arms to welcome back a son who's squandered absolutely everything. These stories demonstrate that divine mercy tirelessly seeks people out. It runs right into the mess, completely uncalculated, without ever counting the cost. Which brings us to section 3, unconditional love. Now, this specific teaching completely strips away our natural biases. Look, it is super easy to love people who love us back, right? Or people who look and think like we do. But the text challenges us to elevate our empathy to match a divine, unconditional standard. It means extending grace, doing good things, and lending a hand without expecting a single thing in return, even to the people we might consider enemies. The sources connect this ancient wisdom perfectly to a deeply rooted cultural tradition captured in the Vietnamese proverb you see here, which means, love others exactly as you love yourself. Think about it. When you're hungry or cold or sick, you don't ignore it, do you? You treat your own pain with immediate urgency. True mercy asks us to take that exact same urgency and apply it to the pain of the strangers and neighbors around us.
And that leads us to our final section, our main focus today: how to truly experience mercy. So, how do we actually feel this in our daily lives? The sources describe experiencing mercy as a continuous flowing cycle. Step 1, you've got to look inward and humbly accept grace for your own flaws. Step 2 is recognizing that mercy usually comes to us through tangible kindness, maybe the caring touch of a parent, a friend's sympathetic look, or quiet help from a total stranger. Once you receive and recognize that love, the framework says you're finally equipped for step 3, extending that exact same compassion outward. Okay, but what does extending compassion look like in the real world? The tangible applications drawn from our sources mean actively helping the poor, visiting the sick and lonely, supporting those in prison, and aiding victims of natural disasters. The sources specifically call out the massive relief efforts during the 2016 Central Vietnam floods as a prime example. Giving up our own comfort to help the marginalized is how we truly recognize a divine presence in the suffering, instead of overthinking who is actually worthy of our help. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. Learning all about the deep theology of mercy is great, but the sources argue that truly experiencing it requires you to actually cross the road and take action. So, are you ready to look past your own comfort, see the pain in someone else, and be the Good Samaritan in your own neighborhood today?
Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, so let's jump right in. Have you ever tried to read ancient biblical stories? Or maybe sat down to watch a screen adaptation and found yourself feeling just completely overwhelmed? Well, you are definitely not alone. Today, we're going to explore exactly why these ancient texts can feel so jarring to modern audiences, and more importantly, how we can peel back the layers to uncover their true meaning. Let's dive right into this exact reaction from a Reddit user who tried watching a popular biblical show. They hopped online and posted this. Watched about half a first episode. It's too much for me. Right now it's too confusing and too scary and too violent. They were totally overwhelmed by the grit, the dark themes, and just the intense historical reality of the first century. It was way too much to process all at once. So, this brings us to a really crucial question that scholars and theologians ask all the time. When we consume these narratives, are we getting stuck on the confusing surface and missing the actual message? It is so easy to get bogged down by the terrifying storms, the strict ancient laws, and the historical brutality that we totally miss the profound truths woven underneath.
Section 1. Confused by the story? That Reddit user we just talked about? They noted a total barrage of dark themes hitting them right out of the gate. We're talking demonic possessions, violent Roman soldiers demanding taxes, mysterious rabbis performing unfamiliar rituals, and incredibly strict Sabbath rules. I mean, catching a fish on the wrong day was considered a grave sin. It's a lot to take in. In fact, it's so intense that other users in that same forum suggested alternatives like minnow Bible stories if you're looking for a gentler, animated, family-friendly introduction to the text.
But here's where the perspective shifts. As one commenter brilliantly points out, the text uses this initial darkness intentionally.
The harsh reality of biblical times isn't just there for shock value, it literally sets the stage. It's designed to show just how terrible things were and how desperately the world needed a savior to arrive. The grit is essentially the canvas for the grace.
Section 2. The Spectacle Trap.
So, the real crucial point here is understanding how these texts actually define a miracle. In modern pop culture, we tend to think of miracles as magic tricks, or actually more like superhuman feats. But scholars note that in these texts, a miracle is strictly defined as an extraordinary event meant to reveal or confirm a specific divine message. In the book of John, they are literally referred to as signs. They aren't just flashy spectacles to relieve physical pain. They're signposts pointing to a much greater truth. Take this massive number, for example, 5,000. This references the famous story where over 5,000 men, and by the way, that's not even counting women and children, are fed with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And not only is everyone fed, but there are 12 baskets of leftovers. To put that into perspective, that's like feeding a whole concert crowd with a single packed lunch. It is a massive, mind-bending spectacle.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the huge contrast between the two entirely different ways this event was experienced. According to the text, the next day the crowd tracks Jesus down. But they didn't track him down because they understood the spiritual sign. They tracked him down because they wanted another free meal. They saw the spectacle, the full stomachs and the magic, but they totally missed what it actually meant, the arrival of the bread of life. They wanted the physical bread, but missed the spiritual truth.
Section 3. Miracles as divine signs.
Theological sources actually categorize these divine signs into 3 distinct areas that go way beyond mere spectacle: healing the sick, controlling nature, and resurrection. Each of these categories was carefully designed to communicate something very specific to the people of that era.
Let's look at the first category, healing. Back in that society, diseases like leprosy meant you were considered unclean, an absolute outcast. When a man born blind was healed at the pool of Siloam, or a leper was touched, the goal wasn't just curing physical bodies. The true sign was breaking the deeply ingrained societal stigma that disease was a punishment from God for sin. It revealed a divine nature rooted in profound compassion, not retribution.
Then you have the control over nature. Imagine you're on a tiny boat in the Sea of Galilee during a massive, life-threatening storm. The texts describe a moment where the raging storm was calmed with just a few words: "Quiet, be still." Instantly, the wind and waves stopped. This wasn't just to save a boat. It was to prove absolute authority over the laws of physics and nature itself.
And the ultimate display of physical power was resurrection. The most striking example is calling a man named Lazarus right out of a stone tomb after he'd been dead for 4 days. The texts note that this monumental event sent absolute shockwaves through the region. It was meant to prepare believers for the greatest mystery of their faith, conquering death itself.
Section 4. The ultimate message: mercy.
Consider the incredibly tense story of the woman caught in adultery. She is dragged out in front of this self-righteous Pharisaical crowd demanding her execution. They're holding stones, citing ancient laws, their eyes just full of contempt and judgment. She's facing a literal death sentence, feeling entirely abandoned, condemned, and utterly alone. The crowd is out for blood, demanding a violent response. But instead of matching their aggression, Jesus does something totally unexpected. He remains completely silent and simply writes in the dirt.
Then he delivers this profound crowd-dispersing challenge. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Slowly, from the oldest down to the youngest, the accusers drop their stones and walk away, leaving only the woman.
For theologians, this brilliantly, I mean just perfectly, illustrates the absolute core of divine mercy in the text. He looks at her and says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." He doesn't offer a death sentence, and he doesn't give a harsh lecture. He offers radical forgiveness, a clean slate, and a chance to start over.
When you really read into the depths of these stories, scholars argue that the true miracle wasn't the spectacle at all. It wasn't the flashy magic of walking on water or multiplying food. The text suggests the greatest miracle was the quiet, transformative power of mercy that heals the soul. It's boundless, unconditional love in the face of human brokenness.
Section 5. Reading between the lines.
So how do we make sure we don't miss these profound messages when we read these texts today? The creators of deep Bible stories suggest a very specific method. You can't just skim the scary or confusing parts and hope you'll understand the whole shebang. You have to study the text progressively, book by book, chapter by chapter, line by line. You really have to walk alongside a teacher and dig in to uncover that hidden depth. There's this quote from their community that beautifully summarizes why this deep dive is so necessary. Aging happens to the body. Finishing well happens in the soul. You absolutely must look past the superficial physical events, the aging, the storms, the historical grit. Because while just surviving these stories is a good mental exercise, truly understanding the mercy and love beneath them, that's what changes the soul.
I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder as you consume these ancient narratives moving forward. Think back to that crowd of 5,000 people. When you approach these texts, are you just seeking the spectacle? Are you just looking for the bread? Or are you ready to look past the surface, confront the darkness, and find the truth?
Hey everyone, and welcome to another Explainer. Today, we're actually trying to bridge a pretty massive gap. We're looking at the space between our modern viewing habits, right, and the incredibly profound ancient texts of the Bible. You know, if you've ever sat down to watch a modern adaptation of biblical history and just felt completely overwhelmed by how gritty the reality was, trust me, you are absolutely not alone in that.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today's Explainer. 1. Struggling with ancient texts. 2. Modern tools for faith. 3. The power to heal. 4. Over nature and death. 5. The purpose of miracles. And finally, 6. A story of divine mercy.
Section 1. Struggling with ancient texts. Let's just set the stage here, because the first century was a radically different world from ours. It was harsh, it was gritty, and it was under very strict Roman occupation. I really want you to imagine the sheer shock of seeing that biblical era portrayed vividly on your TV screen. Think about it. The demon possession, the heavy taxes, the Roman soldiers everywhere, the really visceral reality of ancient diseases. For a lot of people, their very first exposure to a high-production historical drama about Jesus actually leaves them asking a simple question. Is the first century just too scary to watch?
We'll take a look at this real reaction from a viewer on a Reddit forum for the wildly popular series The Chosen. They wrote, "Watched about half of first episode. It's too much for me right now. It's too confusing and too scary and too violent." They actually go on to ask if there's a kid-friendly or family-friendly version out there instead. And honestly,
This perfectly captures the empathy we really need to have for people who are just stepping into this history for the first time. The creators of these shows are trying to accurately depict the darkness of the era, to show exactly why a savior was needed in the first place. But for a modern viewer, it can be totally 100% overwhelming. Section 2, Modern Tools for Faith. Fortunately, if jumping straight into a gritty historical drama is just too much, there are plenty of alternative paths. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer variety of tools we have today to bridge that historical gap. For a gentler introduction, you've got classic animations like VeggieTales or Minnow Bible stories that explain these big concepts simply. Now, for those who just want the direct scripture, no added Hollywood drama whatsoever, there's the word-for-word NIV Gospel of John film. If you're looking to actually study the text deeply, YouTube channels like Deep Bible Stories offer these amazing chapter-by-chapter breakdowns. And hey, for those who do want to stick with shows like The Chosen, their app provides these incredible roundtable discussions. They literally sit down the creator, a Catholic priest, an evangelical, and a Jewish rabbi to discuss the historical and theological accuracy of what you just watched. It's such a great way to digest these complex stories.
Section 3. The power to heal. So, now that we have the tools, let's look at the actual historical accounts themselves, starting with the miracles of physical healing. When you look at the text, there are 3 pivotal moments that really stand out. First up, healing leprosy. We have to remember, in that society, having leprosy basically meant you were physically and socially dead. You were a total outcast. But Jesus didn't just heal the man from a distance, he physically touched him, saying, "I am willing, be clean." Second, there's the healing of the man born blind. Jesus used mud, saliva, and told him to wash in the pool of Siloam. He restored sight to a guy who had literally only ever known darkness. But this third step, this is absolutely critical. Jesus heals a paralyzed man, but he actually starts by saying, "Your sins are forgiven." You really have to understand the cultural context here. Back then, severe illness was very often viewed directly as a punishment for sin. So by forgiving the man's sins and making him walk, Jesus was demonstrating authority over both the physical body and the spiritual realm at the same time.
Section 4. Over nature and death. Now, the accounts don't just stop at physical healing. They escalate, and they escalate rapidly.
Let's move to the next phase and see how this builds. We start with those physical healings we just talked about, but then, picture this. The disciples are out on a tiny boat in the Sea of Galilee during an absolutely massive storm. They are terrified. They think they're going to die. Jesus wakes up, looks at the storm, and simply says, "Quiet, be still." And the laws of physics literally obey him. The wind stops. The sea calms down. But the absolute apex of this authority, that happens at a tomb. A man named Lazarus has been dead. And we're not talking about a few minutes here. He has been dead for 4 days. He is already entombed. And Jesus calls him out, and Lazarus walks out alive. This was meant to be the ultimate, undeniable display that his power had absolutely no earthly limits.
Section 5. The purpose of miracles. So, with all this incredible power on display, what was the actual goal? Because, as we'll see, Jesus wasn't just putting on a magic show.
If you read the Gospel of John, miracles are almost exclusively referred to as signs. Think about what a sign does when you're driving down the highway. You don't look at a sign that says, "New York, 50 miles," and say, "Wow, what a beautiful sign, we finally arrived," right? No, the sign just points you toward a much greater reality further down the road. That's exactly what these miracles were. They were extraordinary events designed to point the witnesses toward a deeper spiritual truth. They affirmed divine authority rather than just providing temporary physical relief.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how perfectly it illustrates human nature. Okay, so Jesus feeds a crowd of over 5,000 people, which is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Naturally, the crowd hunts him down the very next day. But Jesus actually calls them out on it. He tells them point blank, "You're only looking for me because you got a free meal." They wanted a continuous supply of physical bread, but they completely missed the actual sign. The physical bread was supposed to point them to the fact that Jesus was offering them the bread of life, meaning spiritual salvation. They were just so hyper-focused on their immediate physical needs that they were totally blind to the massive spiritual offering right in front of them.
Section 6, a story of divine mercy. Because, honestly, perhaps the most profound application of Jesus' ministry wasn't some massive spectacle. It was a deeply, deeply human moment of compassion.
The sources highlight this incredibly powerful story of a woman who was caught in adultery. She is dragged out before this hostile, angry crowd. The law at the time dictates that she should be stoned to death. The crowd is totally self-righteous, rocks in hand, ready to execute her. But Jesus, he just bends down, writes something in the dirt, and delivers a single line that completely shatters the mob's self-righteousness. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." And one by one, the crowd just drops their rocks and walks away. When they are finally alone, Jesus doesn't condemn her. Instead, he offers her boundless mercy and just tells her to go and sin no more. It's a moment that perfectly encapsulates the idea that the ultimate goal of his authority wasn't about punishment. It was about transformation.
So, the crucial point is this. Engaging with these ancient texts isn't just some academic exercise in history. And it's definitely more than just figuring out how to survive the daily struggles of life. The community over at the Deep Bible Stories channel recently shared a quote that I think really anchors this whole concept. It says, "Aging happens to the body. Finishing well happens in the soul." Think about that. All those physical healings, the multiplying of the bread, that was all for the body. But the true ultimate focus of these texts, it's about building up the soul. And that leaves us with a really important question to reflect on today. Whether you are reading these ancient texts for the very first time or you're streaming a modern adaptation on your phone right now, beyond just getting through the day-to-day, what are you feeding your spirit? Will you just survive long in the physical sense, or will you actually finish well in your soul? I really hope this explainer has given you some great tools and a fresh perspective on how to engage with these powerful historical narratives. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep learning.
Welcome, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's explainer. We're tackling a topic that so many of us struggle with: how to effectively study the Bible. Look, if you've ever felt totally intimidated by the sheer size or the historical distance of the text, you're in the exact right place. We're going to break this all down into clear, actionable steps using some really incredible sources. So let's just get right into it. Let's start by validating a very real struggle here. Have you ever opened up the text, read a few chapters, and walked away feeling, well, more bewildered than edified? If so, you are definitely not alone. I mean, reading ancient texts can be incredibly confusing, and it's so easy to feel like you're just missing the whole point entirely. So here is our roadmap for today. 1, the reading problem. 2, the learner's attitude. 3, reading comprehension methods. 4, utilizing resources. And finally, number 5, practice over consumption. All right, let's dive straight into this first section and address the elephant in the room. Why exactly is it so hard to just get started? Well, this right here is one of the most common hurdles, and it's beautifully highlighted in an article by Desiring God. People simply say, "I don't understand what I read." It's a completely relatable roadblock, right? When we don't understand something, our natural human instinct is to just close the book, feel defeated, and walk away. So the crucial point is how we actually respond to that confusion. As the source material points out, the real solution starts with actively seeking illumination rather than just passively reading words on a page. When it feels totally bewildering, we're supposed to ask difficult questions and seek out instruction. We have to lean in, not pull away. Moving on to section 2, the learner's attitude. Overcoming this whole reading problem requires a complete mindset shift on our part. It's actually fascinating to look at the very definition of a word we hear all the time. The word disciple literally means a learner. Think about that for a second. The entire foundation of following these teachings is rooted in the posture of a willing learner. It's not about having all the answers up front. It's about actively seeking to be taught. And this brilliantly illustrates two essential attitudes we see over in the book of Acts. On one hand, you have the Ethiopian eunuch. He showed incredible humility by admitting he actually needed a tutor to understand what he was reading. And on the other hand, you have the Bereans. They were basically the original fact checkers, right? Diligently searching the text daily to verify what they heard. Humility to ask for help and the discipline to verify. Those are the twin engines of a truly great learner. Okay, now that we've established the right attitude, let's get into the practical tactics. How do we actually break down these complex passages? If you want a highly effective place to start, try this 3-step method for studying the miracles of Jesus outlined by biblical researchers. First, read through the Gospels. Second, don't just skim. Actually make a list of each miracle and the explanation recorded alongside it. And third, look for the deeper truth behind the event. Doing this transforms abstract reading into a structured, actionable process. Applying that method reveals something fascinating. Jesus never performed miracles just for show or, for entertainment. Every single miracle was a sign, pointing to a much larger, deeper truth. For example, when he turned water into wine, it wasn't just to save a wedding host from embarrassment. It was a sign that revealed his glory and caused his disciples to believe. The text is always pointing deeper. And we see this exact same practicality in his words. When looking at the famous Sermon on the Mount, scholars point out that Jesus taught practical principles for life, rather than just preaching abstract theological knowledge. He was giving his listeners a very practical textbook for daily living. Understanding this completely changes how we read. We aren't just absorbing facts, we're learning how to live. Let's move to our 4th section and look at some incredible modern tools to help you on this journey. Because guess what? You don't have to do this alone. We live in an amazing time for learning, and I enthusiastically want to curate this digital toolkit for you, pulled straight from community recommendations. If you need help with literary structure and themes, the animated explainers by Bible Project are absolutely fantastic. For theology and apologetics, Truth Unites comes highly recommended. And for deep chapter-by-chapter, book-by-book study, Deep Bible Stories provides an excellent guide. These resources beautifully combine deep academic backgrounds with highly engaging visual formats. As the creators behind Deep Bible Stories note, the digital world is a brand new frontier for learning. These tools are designed to sit right beside your open book. They provide the immediate historical context and background that you might otherwise miss on your own, making deep study entirely accessible no matter where you're starting from. All right, let's pivot to our fifth and final section. And honestly, this is without a doubt the absolute most crucial part of this entire explainer. Listen to this powerful warning that surfaced in a community discussion online. Christianity is not for consumption, it is for practice. It is so easy today to just binge watch theology like it's the latest Netflix series. We can fill our heads with endless facts and history, but if it doesn't actually change how we live, we've entirely missed the point.
The ultimate goal of understanding the word as Jesus explained in his parables is to bear good fruit. Furthermore, the core of these teachings is meant to bring actual blessings into our daily lives, rather than making us live in constant fear of making a mistake. It's an active, joyful application of truth.
And what happens when people actually practice this together? Well, we see the model of the early believers in Acts chapter 2. They devoted themselves to learning, to fellowship, and to genuinely caring for one another. That is the true power of applying the text in real life. Effective study doesn't lead to isolated know-it-alls. It leads to building strong, deeply supportive communities. So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative question. Where will you start today? You don't have to master it all at once. Pick one method, maybe that 3-step miracle study, or pick one digital tool to guide you through a single chapter. Just shift your mindset to that of a humble learner and take your very first step from confusion to clarity today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I absolutely can't wait to see you in the next one.
Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating journey. We're looking at how people go from feeling totally, maybe even hopelessly overwhelmed by ancient biblical media to actually decoding its deepest, most transformative messages. Let's just jump right in.
Now, if you've ever tried to dive headfirst into ancient biblical history, or maybe you sat down to watch one of those highly acclaimed historical adaptations and just felt, well, totally lost, let me assure you, you are absolutely not alone. Honestly, it can kind of feel like stepping onto an alien planet sometimes. Just to give you an idea, one Reddit user dropped this incredibly authentic, raw reaction to the very first episode of the hit show The Chosen. They were essentially begging the community for help, saying it was just too confusing, too scary, and too violent. They were completely blindsided. Section 1. Confusion in Media. Modern Depictions. So let's start by unpacking that reaction, right? Why does the first century biblical world feel so remarkably intense to us modern viewers? Well, the community was super quick to respond to that overwhelmed viewer. They pointed out that the brutal realities of the first century, we're talking heavy Roman oppression, aggressive taxes, and yes, even demonic possession. They aren't just thrown in there for shock value. No way. They're intentionally shown to set the historical stage. It's all about clearly highlighting the profound, heavy darkness that existed in the world right before Jesus arrives. It sets the stakes.
But hey, if that gritty historical accuracy is a bit too harsh, it's totally okay. The community highly recommends a hard pivot to some family-friendly alternatives. Shows like VeggieTales, Minnow Bible Stories, or the upcoming animated series The Chosen Adventures are fantastic ways to grasp these ancient narratives, without all that intense trauma.
Section 2. Decoding Divine Signs, Understanding Miracles. Now, if we do decide to stick with the historical context, we really have to learn how to decode what these miraculous events actually mean. That's the only way to truly grasp the light that's breaking through that dark world.
When we look at the theological sources, they really emphasize that miracles, they were never meant to be these flashy magic tricks just designed to wow a crowd. Not at all. Rather, every single one of these acts was meant as a signpost. They're pointing directly to a greater truth, revealing divine authority, and frankly, demonstrating this immense, undeniable compassion for human suffering. Historically speaking, these signs generally fell into three pretty awe-inspiring categories. First, restoring health to the outcast. Think healing lepers or giving sight to the blind. Second, mastering the chaotic forces of nature. And third, the absolute ultimate display of power, resurrecting the dead.
Now, it's interesting because when modern media adapts these signs today, they sometimes make some very specific creative choices. For example, as discussed in the Chosen app roundtables by the show's creators, Jesus' actual first recorded miracle was turning water into wine. But in the show, they creatively adapt things to show Peter's massive, miraculous catch of fish first. Why? Well, it powerfully introduces the core characters to the audience right off the bat, while keeping the foundational biblical message completely intact. It's a smart narrative choice.
Section 3, Power over Nature, Conquering Death. Let's look a little closer at this. It's actually wild how easily these magnificent displays of power could be completely, utterly misunderstood by the very crowds who witnessed them firsthand. A brilliant example of this disconnect is the famous feeding of the 5,000. Imagine you're there. The hungry crowd excitedly saw what basically amounted to the world's greatest free lunch buffet, right? They just wanted the physical food to keep on coming. But in doing so, they completely missed the massive spiritual sign standing right in front of them. Because according to the text, the real miracle was never ever just about lunch. The physical bread was simply a signpost. It was meant to show that he offered eternal spiritual sustenance, not just a quick fix of temporary physical relief. And this divine power, it extended to its absolute unimaginable limit. We see this firsthand through the resurrection of figures like Jairus' 12-year-old daughter, the widow's son in Nain, and of course, most famously, Lazarus, who had literally been in the grave for 4 days. The sources make it clear, these weren't just spectacular events to wow a crowd. They were preparation for the ultimate victory over death itself.
Section 4. Message of Mercy. The ultimate gift. Yet, even with all those incredible displays of physical power, the most relatable and truly life-changing sign was often found in the quiet, intimate miracle of mercy.
Consider this truly terrifying historical narrative for a second. A woman caught in adultery is dragged right out into the open before a violently self-righteous mob. They are literally armed with stones, demanding her immediate execution under the law. I mean, you can just imagine the sheer panic and absolute hopelessness she must have felt in that moment.
But instead of joining in their condemnation, Jesus does something totally unexpected. He bends down in silence and then completely disarms this angry, hypocritical crowd with one profound challenge. He says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Talk about a mic drop, right? This forces every single accuser to stop and confront their own hidden flaws. And one by one, they drop their stones and they just walk away.
Once the accusers vanished, he turned to the woman and offered her these breathtaking words, "I do not condemn you. Go and sin no more." Just like that, in a single instant, he entirely erased her death sentence. He replaced it with unconditional love
and a clear mandate to start a brand new life. As one beautiful theological reflection notes, this concept of divine mercy, it isn't just a simple pardon. It's not just someone patting you on the back and saying, "Hey, you're off the hook." No, it is the vital, life-giving strength needed to stand back up after a massive failure, dust yourself off, and completely rebuild your life. It's an absolute game changer. Section 5. Deeper into the Word. Building a foundation. So, bringing this all together, how do, as a modern audience, take these confusing ancient stories, these profound acts of mercy, and actually build a lasting foundation today? Well, we're actually seeing a massive hunger for this exact kind of depth online right now. In communities like the Deep Bible Stories channel, you have hundreds of thousands of people who are deciding to move past that surface-level viewing. Instead, they're choosing to go through the texts book by book, chapter by chapter, line by line. And that community beautifully summarizes their mission with this amazing quote: "Aging happens to the body, finishing well happens in the soul." For them, the whole point of pushing past the initial confusion of the ancient world is to ensure exactly that, finishing well. So as you encounter these ancient texts, or even their amazing modern adaptations, the ultimate question is really yours to answer. Are you just going to stand in the crowd watching the spectacle, or are you finally ready to go deeper and decode the signs for yourself? Think about it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time. Welcome to today's explainer. Today we're looking at some of the most foundational and honestly most debated stories in all of human history. We're going to explore exactly how modern media adapts these ancient biblical texts, moving from the gritty, often harsh reality of those times to the really profound concepts of miracles and mercy found in our source material. Okay, let's dive into this.
You know, one modern viewer on a Reddit thread discussing a popular biblical TV show recently summed this feeling up perfectly. They wrote, "Watched about half of first episode. It's too much for me right now. It's too confusing and too scary and too violent." And man, that is incredibly relatable, isn't it? When we jump straight into these highly accurate historical settings, the reality can feel incredibly harsh and just totally overwhelming to new viewers. The cultural and historical gap we're dealing with is massive.
So that brings us to a really central question. How do we actually make sense of this harsh biblical world? Because when the original texts or these highly accurate adaptations feel unapproachable or even a little frightening, we need clear, structured ways to learn about these ancient times without getting completely lost in the historical shock of it all. Section 1. Approaching the biblical world. Now, to bridge this gap, audiences and especially families are turning to modern solutions. For adults who want that line-by-line context, there are some great deep dive YouTube channels out there. But for those needing something a bit more accessible, the sources point to upcoming animated series like The Chosen Adventures, Minnows, Laugh and Grow Bible Stories, and even classic animations like VeggieTales. These adaptations are absolutely crucial because they help audiences digest these complex scriptural narratives in a way that's structured, safe, and just much easier to understand. Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds. The categories of miracles.
So the sources detail numerous supernatural events, but to keep us from getting totally overwhelmed by the sheer volume of history here, we can actually organize the 7 major miracles into 3 distinct buckets. We've got healing, nature, and resurrection. And as you'll see, each category targets a completely different aspect of the human experience. Let's break these down.
First up, the healing miracles. The sources highlight a few key events here. Curing the socially outcasts, like those with leprosy, was absolutely huge. Why? Because in the ancient world, illness was often heavily stigmatized. It was seen as a direct punishment for sin. Jesus also brought light to the dark by healing a man blind from birth using just mud and water, and he restored mobility to a paralyzed man while simultaneously offering him forgiveness. You see, these weren't just medical fixes. They were radical acts that completely broke down those deeply entrenched ancient social stigmas.
Next, we have the nature miracles. Here, the text describes Jesus demonstrating incredible control over the physical elements of the world. Turning water to wine at a wedding in Cana actually saved a family from complete social ruin. Calming a violent storm on the Sea of Galilee showed absolute mastery over chaotic weather. And then, well, there's the sheer scale of the feeding of the 5,000. Multiplying just 5 loaves and 2 fish from a young boy's lunch to feed a massive crowd. I mean, it's a staggering display of providing for physical needs on a macro level.
The third category is the resurrection miracles. This is presented as the ultimate display of overcoming human mortality. The sources recount the raising of Jairus' 12-year-old daughter with the phrase Talitha Kumi, returning a widow's only son to her at 9, and of course, culminating in the shocking story of calling Lazarus out of a stone tomb after he had literally been dead for 4 days. These events are positioned in the texts as the absolute pinnacle of power over the natural order of life and death.
Section 3. More than just magic.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core tension in these narratives: physical relief versus spiritual truth. The crowds often just wanted the physical satisfaction, getting a free meal of bread and fish, or experiencing immediate relief from bodily pain. But the texts argue that the true goal was the spiritual truth. It was about demonstrating divine authority and pointing to Jesus as the spiritual bread of life. The physical stuff was really just a vehicle for the deeper spiritual message. This quote from the sources perfectly captures that exact tension. Jesus says to the crowd, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves." He is actively challenging them here. He's telling them that these miracles were meant to be intentional signs pointing to something much greater. They weren't just a free magic show or a meal ticket just because they ate their fill and satisfied their physical hunger.
So, what was the true purpose of these signs? Well, based on the analytical consensus from our sources, we've summarized it into 3 main points. First, affirming divine authority and identity. Second, demonstrating deep, genuine compassion for human suffering. And third, inviting people to repentance and a change of heart. These acts were deeply rooted in empathy, rather than just some desire to show off power. They were meant to fundamentally transform the viewer.
Section 4. The message of mercy.
All right, let's set the scene based on the source text. Imagine that harsh biblical reality we discussed at the very beginning of this explainer. Picture an angry mob, armed with a very strict interpretation of the law, and a terrified woman caught in adultery who's facing a brutal death sentence by stoning. She's completely surrounded by self-righteous accusers. The tension in this moment is incredibly high.
The text portrays Jesus entering this chaotic scene, but his response is completely unexpected. He doesn't respond with violence, and he doesn't yell back at the angry mob. Instead, it's a remarkably quiet response. He bends down and begins writing silently in the dirt. It's this powerful, totally disarming silence that forces everyone there to just pause and reflect on the situation.
Then he stands up and delivers one of the most famous lines in history. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. So the crucial point is how this single sentence completely shifted the judgment. He took the spotlight off the terrified woman and shined it directly back onto the conscience of the mob itself.
The reaction, as detailed in the text, is honestly a masterpiece of human psychology. The crowd leaves, one by one. And importantly, they start from the oldest down to the youngest. The sheer psychological weight of their own conscience, the sudden realization of their own flaws and past mistakes, it forces them to literally drop their stones and walk away.
Once the crowd is gone, we finally get the resolution. Jesus says to the woman, "Neither do I condemn you, go, and from now on sin no more." This is the radical application of forgiveness. In a world defined by harsh laws and immediate physical punishment, she is suddenly offered a completely clean slate. As you'll see, the ultimate miracle in these texts isn't about bending the laws of physics. It's about transforming a life through unconditional love and giving someone a second chance. According to our sources, this act of pure mercy represents the core message behind all the physical miracles and the biblical narratives we've explored today. It's fundamentally about the transformation of the human heart. I want to leave you with this final thought. How does this ancient message of radical compassion translate to our modern world? We might not be able to calm storms or physically multiply food, but perhaps giving someone a second chance or showing genuine empathy in a harsh world might just be the most powerful miracle you can perform today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this structured look at the source material has given you a clear, fascinating new perspective.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating task, analyzing exactly how ancient texts, specifically the New Testament, describe the concept of how God guides humanity. We're going to look closely at the cultural and spiritual footprint of Jesus Christ, and specifically how these source texts outline a whole framework for divine direction. It's essentially a structured look at an ancient belief system that has absolutely shaped a massive chunk of world history. But, before we get into the how, we really have to acknowledge the sheer scale of this influence. We're talking about over 2.2 billion followers today. To put that into perspective, that's over a quarter of the global population. We're looking at a scenario where the teachings of one single historical figure have fundamentally shaped the morals, ethics, and worldviews of billions of people. So whatever your personal background might be, the undeniable footprint of these texts makes this an incredibly compelling study. So how exactly is this guidance described in the text? Well, it's framed as being highly personal. The text actually says, "My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me." Notice how guidance isn't described as some distant commander shouting orders from the clouds, right? It's the classic shepherd and sheep metaphor. The texts establish right out of the gate that this divine guidance is intensely relational. It's entirely based on knowing and being known. To understand exactly how this works, we'll break the source material down into 5 distinct pillars: the foundation of guidance, guiding through parables, the Sermon on the Mount, miracles of mercy, and finally, eternal guidance. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the foundation of guidance. The absolute baseline here isn't fear, and it definitely isn't rigid compliance. It's unconditional love. The texts describe this deep, sacrificial love directed both toward God and toward humanity as the core moral foundation of Jesus' teachings. And the sources really emphasize that this guidance is rooted in mercy.
It's designed to offer hope and salvation rather than, a fear-based religious system where you're constantly terrified of angering the divine spirits. It's a completely different paradigm.
Moving right along to section 2, guiding through parables.
Now, the texts show us that Jesus didn't just rely on abstract philosophical lectures. Instead, he used highly relatable stories. We see themes of lost and found, like the prodigal son, themes of nature, like the mustard seed, and everyday life, like the sower. He literally used the daily realities of an ancient agricultural society, farmers, debtors, fathers, and sons, to guide his listeners toward understanding some incredibly complex spiritual mysteries. It was genius in its simplicity.
But the sources point out that these weren't just simple fables with a nice little moral at the end. They were actually highly strategic narratives. The text notes that parables were designed to force the listener to see their own situation, to reflect, and ultimately to make a hard choice. They were interactive tools of guidance meant to reveal exactly where a person truly stood.
All right, on to section 3, the Sermon on the Mount. A really vital contrast we see in the sources is between strict legalism and this new guidance. The older legalism of the time featured a heavy focus on the exact letter of the law, strict rule following, and frankly, a fear of retribution. In contrast, the new guidance introduced in the Sermon on the Mount completely flips the script. It focuses on the spirit of the law, on grace, on blessings, and internal transformation. Instead of starting off with a list of heavy demands, the text says Jesus started by listing 9 distinct blessings, offering peace rather than anxiety. And here is a super crucial distinction made in our sources. Jesus taught rather than lectured. So what does that actually mean? Well, lecturing is kind of just delivering heavy theoretical monologues, right? But teaching in this context meant providing practical, systematic principles for daily living. He was giving people actionable guidance on how to treat their enemies, how to pray, and how to view wealth, essentially making the profound highly practical for everyday life. Which brings us to section 4, miracles of mercy.
The sources recount numerous physical miracles, and we're talking about events that completely defied the laws of nature, turning water to wine to save a family from public embarrassment at a wedding in Cana, calming a violent storm on the Sea of Galilee with just a word, and feeding over 5,000 people with merely 5 loaves and 2 fish. Literally impossible stuff. But according to the texts, these events were meant to demonstrate absolute authority over the natural elements, fully backing up the authority of his teachings.
Now, there's a really important distinction made in the Gospel of John, which calls these miracles divine signs. The sources explicitly state these were never performed as magic tricks for showmanship or self-promotion. That is a massive distinction to keep in mind. They were done out of deep empathy for human suffering and designed as divine signs meant to confirm his authority, reveal God's compassion, and physically guide people toward faith and repentance. And finally, section 5, eternal guidance. The sources state that before his departure, Jesus prayed intensely for the unity of his followers. But more importantly for our topic today, he promised them the Holy Spirit. The texts claim this Spirit would act as an internal guide, constantly reminding them of his teachings, providing ongoing strengths, and, this is key, transitioning divine guidance from a physical presence walking beside them to a permanent internal reality living within them. This perfectly sets up the vine and the branches metaphor from the Gospel of John. The text reads, only the branch connected to the vine can bear good fruit. The main takeaway here is that this kind of divine guidance isn't just some one-time instruction manual you read once and toss on a shelf. It's a living ecosystem. It absolutely requires a continuous, active, spiritual connection to the source in order to actually work. We noted earlier that the sources say parables were specifically designed to force the listener to take a stance. So if these ancient stories of unconditional love, grace, and mercy are really meant to provoke a choice, how do you respond to them today? Does understanding this ancient framework of how God guides humanity change how you view these texts?